Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18th, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. The second of three sons, he entered a world that would shape him into something monstrous. His father Thomas drove buses for a living. His mother Mary worked as a sales clerk, and their home was a battleground of dysfunction and control. From the very beginning, Gary's childhood was marked by humiliation and inappropriate boundaries that would twist his developing mind in ways that still horrify psychologists today. Mary Ridgway was described by relatives as domineering, a woman who inflicted corporal punishment on her sons for the smallest infractions. But her treatment of Gary went far beyond normal discipline. He wet the bed until he was 13 years old, and each time it happened, his mother would lash out with a fury that seemed to consume her. She would wash his genitals in what Gary later described as grossly inappropriate intimacy, a violation that planted seeds of rage and sexual confusion that would fester for decades. Gary would later tell defense psychologists that as an adolescent, he had conflicting feelings of anger and sexual attraction toward his mother. He fantasized about killing her, vivid daydreams that played out in his mind like movies. These weren't fleeting thoughts of rebellion that most teenagers experience. These were detailed, methodical fantasies about ending her life, and they brought him a sense of power and control that he craved. The family lived near Seattle's Pacific Highway, a deprived neighborhood near SeaTac Airport, where broken dreams and broken people collected like debris. It was the perfect environment for a child already damaged by his home life to slip further into darkness. At school, Gary struggled academically. He was dyslexic, held back 2 grades, and had an IQ in the low 80s. His teachers saw him as slow and unremarkable. His classmates barely noticed him at all, but Gary noticed everything. He watched, he learned, and he began to understand that the world was divided into those who had power and those who didn't. He decided early on which side he wanted to be on. By his teenage years, Gary was displaying the classic warning signs that criminologists now recognize as harbingers of serial violence. He tortured animals, finding pleasure in their suffering and fear. He set fires, watching the flames consume everything in their path, with the same cold fascination he would later bring to human destruction. And at 16 years old, he committed his first attempted murder. It was a summer day in 1965 when Gary lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods near his home. The child trusted him, followed him willingly into the trees where no one could see or hear what happened next. Gary pulled out a knife and stabbed the boy through the ribs, piercing his liver. As the child lay bleeding and terrified, Gary walked away laughing. "I always wondered what it would be like to kill someone," he said, his voice echoing through the trees like a death sentence. The boy survived, but something fundamental had shifted in Gary Ridgway. He had crossed a line that most people never even approach, and instead of feeling horror or remorse, he felt empowered. He had tasted ultimate control over another human being, and he wanted more. In 1969, Gary graduated from Tyee High School and married his 19-year-old girlfriend, Claudia Craig. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like a normal young couple starting their lives together. Gary had even joined the United States Navy and was about to be deployed to Vietnam, where he would serve on a supply ship and see combat. But beneath the surface of this ordinary life, something dark was growing. During his time in Vietnam, Gary frequented prostitutes with alarming regularity. He contracted gonorrhea multiple times, and while he claimed to be angered by this, he continued the behavior without protection. This pattern of seeking out sex workers while simultaneously harboring resentment toward them would become a defining characteristic of his psychology. He was developing a twisted relationship with sexuality that mixed desire with hatred, pleasure with violence. When Gary returned from Vietnam, he got a job painting trucks at the Kenworth plant in Renton, Washington. It was steady work that he would keep for 30 years, and it gave him the perfect cover for what he was becoming. To his co-workers, he was quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. He showed up on time, did his job, and went home. No one suspected that he was using his knowledge of industrial paint and his access to remote areas to plan something horrific. Gary's first marriage ended in divorce, as did his second. He seemed incapable of maintaining normal relationships, though he continued to try. Throughout each marriage, he was developing what he would later describe as an insatiable sexual desire that grew increasingly dangerous. He became fanatically religious, attending church regularly and speaking often about God and salvation. But this religious fervor didn't calm the storm inside him. Instead, it seemed to fuel his hatred of the women he sought out for sex. In his twisted mind, prostitutes represented everything he despised about himself and his desires. They were to him the embodiment of sin and corruption, and in his growing delusion, he began to see himself as an instrument of divine justice, chosen to cleanse the world of their presence. The first sign that Gary Ridgway was becoming something truly dangerous came in 1980, when he was arrested for allegedly choking a prostitute. He claimed the woman had bitten him, and no charges were filed. 2 years later, he was arrested again, this time for solicitation. To police, he was just another John, another lonely man seeking paid companionship in the shadows of the city. But Gary Ridgway was planning something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. He was about to begin a killing spree that would terrorize the Pacific Northwest for decades and claim the lives of at least 49 women. His victims would be among society's most vulnerable, women and girls who had fallen through the cracks of a system that barely acknowledged their existence. The first victim was 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, a runaway who had been living on the streets and working as a prostitute to survive. On July 15, 1982, her body was discovered floating in the Green River, a pair of blue jeans tied around her neck like a grotesque necklace. Embedded in those jeans were microscopic spheres of industrial spray paint that would eventually lead to Gary's capture. But that breakthrough was still 20 years away. Within a month of Wendy's discovery, 4 more bodies were found along the riverbank. Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, and Cynthia Jean Hines. All young women, all involved in prostitution, all strangled and dumped like garbage in the murky waters of the Green River. The pattern was unmistakable. A serial killer was at work, and he was just getting started. What followed would become one of the longest and most complex murder investigations in American history, a cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement and a predator who seemed to vanish into thin air after each killing. Gary Ridgway had found his calling, and he was very, very good at it. He was methodical, careful, and utterly without remorse. He chose his victims deliberately, targeting women he believed wouldn't be missed, women whose disappearances might go unreported for days or weeks. He strangled them with his bare hands, then disposed of their bodies in remote locations where they might never be found. And through it all, he maintained his ordinary life. He went to work, attended church, and even married for a third time. To everyone who knew him, Gary Ridgway was just another face in the crowd, a quiet man living a quiet life. But in the darkness of the Pacific Northwest, he was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming the Green River Killer, and his reign of terror was only just beginning. As the 1980s dawned, Gary Ridgway had already tasted blood. The 2 arrests in 1980 and 1982 should have been warning signs, red flags that something darker was brewing beneath the surface of this mild-mannered truck painter. But the system let him slip through the cracks, and what followed would become one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history. The Green River itself became his hunting ground, a muddy waterway that wound through the industrial heart of King County, Washington. It was here, along these banks, that Ridgway would dump his first victims, giving birth to a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades, the Green River Killer. July 15, 1982, the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was discovered floating in the Green River, a pair of blue jeans knotted tightly around her neck. She was a runaway, a girl who had slipped through society's safety net and landed in the crosshairs of a predator who understood exactly how to exploit the system's blind spots. Ridgway had chosen his first victim with calculated precision. Within a month, the horror multiplied. 4 more bodies surfaced along the riverbank: Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, and Cynthia Jean Hines, each one strangled, each one discarded like refuse, each one a life cut short by a man who had learned to mask his darkness behind a facade of normalcy. The police knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. 5 young women, all found in the same area, all killed in the same manner. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was methodical, systematic, calculated. A serial killer was stalking the streets of Seattle, and he was just getting started. What made Ridgway so terrifyingly effective wasn't just his ability to kill, but his understanding of who to target. He prowled the Pacific Highway, a stretch of road known locally as the Strip. This was a world of neon lights and broken dreams, where runaway teenagers and desperate women sold themselves to survive. It was a place where people disappeared regularly, where the missing weren't always missed, where a predator could hunt with impunity. Ridgway understood the psychology of vulnerability. He knew that sex workers and runaways existed on the margins of society, that their disappearances might not be immediately reported, that when they were reported, the investigations might lack the urgency reserved for victims from more respectable backgrounds. He was exploiting not just individual desperation, but societal indifference. His method was deceptively simple. He would cruise the Strip in his pickup truck, sometimes with his young son in the back seat, presenting himself as a harmless family man. He was polite, soft-spoken, unthreatening. He offered rides, promised money, spoke kindly to women who had grown accustomed to harsh treatment. To his victims, he must have seemed like salvation, a gentle respite from a cruel world. But once he had them alone, the mask dropped. He would drive them to secluded locations, sometimes his own home, sometimes remote areas where screams wouldn't carry. He would have sex with them, then strangle them, usually with his bare hands. The act of killing became ritualistic for him, a moment of absolute power and control that fed something dark and insatiable within him. After the murder came the disposal. Ridgway was meticulous about this phase, understanding that how he handled the bodies would determine whether he remained free to kill again. He would drive deep into the forests surrounding Seattle, to places where loggers had carved roads through dense wilderness, where a body might lie undiscovered for months or even years. But Ridgway's depravity didn't end with death. He would return to the dump sites, sometimes weeks or months later, to engage in acts of necrophilia with the decomposing remains. This wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about extending his control over his victims even beyond death. He owned them completely, and he wasn't ready to let them go. The body count climbed steadily through 1982 and 1983. The Green River Task Force, formed specifically to catch this killer, found themselves chasing a ghost. They had bodies, they had evidence, they had witnesses who had seen victims get into vehicles, but they couldn't connect the dots to a single suspect. Ridgway was careful, methodical, always one step ahead of the investigation. Part of his success lay in his understanding of forensic science. Despite his limited education, Ridgway had an intuitive grasp of how evidence worked. He chose strangulation over weapons because it was cleaner, leaving fewer traces. He would clip his victims' fingernails if they had scratched him during the struggle. He bought new tires for his truck to eliminate tread evidence. He even planted false clues at crime scenes, moving bodies to confuse investigators about timelines and locations. But perhaps most importantly, Ridgway understood camouflage. He maintained his job at the Kenworth truck plant, showing up every day, working steadily, earning the respect of his supervisors and co-workers. He attended church regularly, projecting an image of religious devotion. He married for the third time in 1988 to a woman named Judith Mawson, who would later claim she never suspected anything unusual about her husband's behavior. This double life was Ridgway's greatest weapon. By day, he was Gary the truck painter, Gary the churchgoer, Gary the devoted husband. By night, he was a predator stalking the streets of Seattle, adding to a body count that would eventually reach nearly 50 confirmed victims. The dichotomy was so complete that even those closest to him remained oblivious to the monster living among them. The investigation struggled against this perfect facade. In 1983, 18-year-old Marie Malvar became a crucial case when her boyfriend and pimp tracked down Ridgway's truck to his home after she disappeared. They were certain this was the vehicle they had seen her enter. Police questioned Ridgway, but he denied knowing anything about Malvar's disappearance. Without physical evidence, they had to let him go. It was a moment that would haunt investigators for decades. They had the right man, the right house, the right vehicle. But Ridgway's calm demeanor, his cooperative attitude, his apparent willingness to help with the investigation threw them off the scent. He even agreed to take a polygraph test in 1984 and passed it, further convincing police that he wasn't their man. Years later, Ridgway would reveal the extent of his deception during that crucial interview. He had deliberately stood against a fence to hide the scratches Marie Malvar had left on his arms during her final, desperate struggle. After the detectives left, he burned the scratches with battery acid to eliminate the evidence. He had been mere moments away from being caught, but his quick thinking and understanding of police procedure saved him. The killing continued through the 1980s, though at a reduced pace. Ridgway was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated in his methods. He began burying some victims instead of leaving them exposed, partly to resist his own urges to return for necrophilia, partly to make discovery less likely. He spread the dump sites across a wider geographic area, making it harder for investigators to predict where he might strike next. Throughout this period, the Green River Task Force grew into one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history. They interviewed thousands of suspects, collected mountains of evidence, consulted with experts including imprisoned serial killer Ted Bundy, who provided insights into the mind of a serial killer. Bundy's advice proved eerily accurate. He suggested that the killer was returning to the dump sites to have sex with the bodies, a detail that investigators would later confirm. But despite their efforts, despite the resources devoted to the case, despite the public attention and media coverage, the Green River Killer remained a phantom. Bodies continued to surface, families continued to grieve, and Gary Ridgway continued to live his quiet life in suburban Seattle, hiding in plain sight. The 1990s brought changes to Ridgway's life and his killing pattern. His marriage to Judith Mawson appeared to have a stabilizing effect on him. He later claimed that he truly loved her, and statistics bear out his assertion that his kill rate decreased significantly after their marriage. Of his 49 confirmed victims, only 3 were killed after he married Mawson in 1988. But the urges never completely disappeared. His final confirmed murder occurred in 1998, 16 years after his first known kill. By then, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, and the evidence that had been collected throughout the 1980s and 1990s was about to become the key to finally solving the case. The breakthrough came in 2001 when advances in DNA analysis allowed investigators to match saliva samples taken from Ridgway in 1987 to semen found on several victims. The man who had eluded capture for nearly 2 decades was finally within reach. On November 30th, 2001, police arrived at the Kenworth truck factory where Ridgway had worked for over 30 years. They found him at his workstation, calmly spray painting truck parts, the same job he had maintained throughout his killing spree. The arrest of Gary Ridgway sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest. For nearly 20 years, the Green River Killer had been a boogeyman, a shadowy figure who represented every parent's worst nightmare. To discover that he was this unremarkable, middle-aged man, this quiet worker who had hidden among them for so long, was almost more terrifying than the mystery itself. As the investigation into the Green River killings intensified throughout the 1980s, Gary Ridgway had become more than just a name on a suspect list. He had become a ghost, a phantom who seemed to slip through the fingers of law enforcement at every turn. The man who would eventually confess to being America's most prolific serial killer was living a double life, so convincing, so meticulously crafted, that even those closest to him never suspected the darkness that consumed him. The Green River Task Force had grown into one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history. Dozens of detectives, forensic specialists, and federal agents were working around the clock, following thousands of leads, interviewing hundreds of suspects, and analyzing mountains of evidence. Yet Ridgway continued his killing spree, methodically selecting victims from the vulnerable populations that populated Seattle's South Pacific Highway, a stretch of road that had become synonymous with tragedy. What made Ridgway so terrifyingly effective wasn't just his ability to blend into ordinary society, but his understanding of how investigations worked. Despite his low IQ and struggles with dyslexia, he possessed an almost intuitive grasp of forensic science and police procedure. He knew that strangulation left less physical evidence than other methods of murder. He understood that moving bodies, changing dump sites, and varying his patterns would make it harder for investigators to establish connections. Most chillingly, he knew that targeting society's most marginalized women would buy him precious time before their disappearances were even noticed. The summer of 1983 marked a particularly brutal period in Ridgway's killing spree. Bodies were being discovered with increasing frequency in the dense forests and remote areas surrounding Seattle. Each crime scene told the same horrifying story. Young women, many barely out of their teens, strangled and discarded like refuse. The killer's signature was becoming clearer with each discovery, but the man himself remained frustratingly elusive. Marie Malvar's case had put Ridgway squarely in the crosshairs of the investigation, yet he had managed to deflect suspicion with a performance that would have impressed seasoned actors. When detectives knocked on his door in 1983, they found a mild-mannered truck painter who seemed genuinely concerned about helping with their investigation. He answered their questions politely, admitted to frequenting the area where prostitutes worked, and even acknowledged that he had been arrested for soliciting in the past. But he denied any involvement in the murders, and his demeanor was so convincing that investigators had no choice but to let him go. What they didn't know was that Ridgway had been preparing for this moment. According to his later confessions, he had strategically positioned himself against a fence during the interview to hide the scratch marks that Marie Malvar had left on his arm during her desperate struggle to escape. After the detectives left, he burned the scratches with battery acid, obliterating any physical evidence that might have linked him to her murder. It was this kind of calculated thinking that allowed him to stay one step ahead of the investigation for nearly 2 decades. The psychological profile that emerged from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit painted a picture of a highly organized killer who was likely employed, possibly married, and deeply familiar with the areas where bodies were being dumped. They theorized that he was someone who could blend seamlessly into the community, someone who wouldn't attract attention or suspicion. In every respect, Gary Ridgway fit this profile perfectly. By day, he was the picture of blue-collar respectability. He showed up to work at the Kenworth Truck Factory on time, did his job painting trucks with meticulous attention to detail, and got along well with his co-workers. Many of them would later describe him as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. He attended church regularly, married for the 3rd time in 1988, and seemed to embody the values of hard work and family that defined much of American society. But as darkness fell over Seattle, Ridgway transformed into something entirely different. He would cruise the Pacific Highway in his pickup truck, trolling for victims among the desperate women who worked the streets. His approach was patient, methodical, and terrifyingly effective. He would engage potential victims in conversation, sometimes even bringing his young son along to appear less threatening. The presence of a child in his vehicle was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his deception, as it gave women a false sense of security that would ultimately cost them their lives. The forensic evidence that would eventually lead to Ridgway's capture was hiding in plain sight throughout the 1980s, waiting for technology to catch up with the investigation. Microscopic paint spheres from the Kenworth factory where he worked were embedded in the clothing of multiple victims, creating a forensic link that wouldn't be discovered for another 2 decades. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory had the evidence in their possession, but the technology to analyze it simply didn't exist at the time. This missed opportunity haunted investigators for years. The paint spheres were a unique signature, as distinctive as a fingerprint that could have connected Ridgway to the murders much earlier. Instead, they sat in evidence rooms, invisible to the naked eye, while the killing continued. It was a sobering reminder of how technology and investigative techniques were still catching up to the sophistication of modern serial killers. As the body count mounted throughout the 1980s, Ridgway's confidence seemed to grow. He began taking greater risks, sometimes returning to dump sites to engage in necrophilia with decomposing corpses. According to his later confessions, these return visits were driven by an insatiable sexual compulsion that he couldn't control. The FBI had theorized that the killer was likely revisiting dump sites, a prediction that proved chillingly accurate when Ridgway finally began talking to investigators. The investigation took on an almost mythical quality in the Pacific Northwest. The Green River Killer had become a boogeyman, a faceless monster who stalked the streets of Seattle and preyed on society's most vulnerable members. Parents warned their children about stranger danger, women traveled in groups, and the sex worker community lived in constant fear. Yet Ridgway moved through this atmosphere of terror completely undetected, protected by his carefully constructed facade of normalcy. What made his crimes even more disturbing was the casual, almost businesslike manner in which he approached murder. In his later confessions, he would describe the killings with the same detached professionalism he brought to his job at the truck factory. There was no passion, no rage, no apparent emotion at all. He killed because he wanted to kill, and he wanted to kill as many people as possible without getting caught. The investigation's focus on Ridgway intensified in 1987 when police obtained hair and saliva samples from him. The samples were preserved and tested using the forensic technology available at the time, but the results were inconclusive. DNA analysis was still in its infancy, and the sophisticated techniques that would eventually seal his fate were still years away from being developed. Once again, Ridgway had dodged a bullet, protected by the limitations of 1980s forensic science. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Green River killings seemed to slow down, though they never completely stopped. Some investigators theorized that the killer had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply moved to a different area. Others believed he was still active, but had become more careful about disposing of bodies. The truth, as it would later emerge, was more complex than anyone imagined. Ridgway's marriage to Judith Mawson in 1988 marked a turning point in his criminal career. According to his own admissions, his kill rate decreased significantly after he entered this relationship. Of his 49 confirmed victims, only 3 were murdered after his marriage to Mawson. Whether this was due to genuine feelings for his wife, fear of being caught, or simply the natural evolution of his criminal behavior remained a subject of debate among criminal psychologists. The 1990s brought new challenges and opportunities for the investigation. Advances in DNA technology were revolutionizing forensic science, and cold cases that had seemed hopeless were suddenly solvable. The Green River Task Force began the painstaking process of re-examining evidence using these new techniques, hoping to find the breakthrough that had eluded them for so long. Meanwhile, Ridgway continued his ordinary life, working at the truck factory, attending church, and maintaining his reputation as a quiet, dependable member of the community. He had successfully compartmentalized his life in a way that allowed him to function normally while harboring the darkest of secrets. The disconnect between his public persona and his private reality was so complete that even trained investigators had been fooled by his performance. As the new millennium approached, the investigation into the Green River killings had become the longest-running serial killer case in American history. Thousands of tips had been followed, hundreds of suspects had been questioned, and millions of dollars had been spent in the pursuit of justice. Yet the killer remained free, protected by his anonymity and the passage of time. The breakthrough that would finally bring Gary Ridgway to justice was just around the corner, hidden in the microscopic evidence that had been waiting patiently in storage for nearly 2 decades. The paint spheres that had been overlooked in the 1980s would soon become the key to unlocking one of the most prolific serial killing sprees in American history. But for now, as the 20th century drew to a close, the Green River Killer remained Seattle's most elusive and terrifying phantom. By the time DNA technology finally caught up with Gary Ridgway in 2001, he had become something of a phantom in the Pacific Northwest. The Green River Task Force had interviewed him multiple times over the years, but each encounter left investigators frustrated and empty-handed. He would sit across from detectives, calm and cooperative, answering their questions with the measured responses of a man who had nothing to hide. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, something far more sinister was calculating every word, every gesture, every opportunity to deflect suspicion. The breakthrough came not from brilliant detective work or a sudden confession, but from microscopic evidence that had been sitting in storage for nearly 2 decades. In 1987, during one of the early investigations, police had collected saliva samples from Ridgway as part of their routine questioning. Those samples had been filed away, waiting for technology to advance enough to unlock their secrets. By 2001, DNA analysis had evolved to the point where those tiny traces of genetic material could be compared against evidence collected from the crime scenes. The match was undeniable. Ridgway's DNA was found on multiple victims, linking him conclusively to murders that had haunted the region for years. On November 30th, 2001, detectives arrived at the Kenworth truck factory where Ridgway had worked as a spray painter for 3 decades. They found him at his workstation, methodically applying paint to truck parts with the same precision he had once used to end lives. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't seem surprised. He simply put down his equipment and allowed himself to be led away in handcuffs. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Here was a man who had lived among them for years, painting trucks by day and stalking victims by night. His co-workers described him as quiet, reliable, even friendly. His neighbors knew him as the guy who went to church regularly and kept his yard neat. His third wife, Judith Mawson, would later reveal that she had noticed some odd behaviors over the years, but had never connected them to anything sinister. She remembered how he would sometimes leave for work unusually early, claiming he needed the overtime pay. She recalled how there was no carpet in his house when she moved in, something that took on a chilling significance when investigators later suggested he had likely used it to wrap bodies. The evidence against Ridgway was overwhelming. Beyond the DNA matches, forensic scientists had made another crucial discovery. Those microscopic paint spheres that had been embedded in victims' clothing for decades were finally analyzed using advanced techniques. The spheres were traced to a specific type of industrial spray paint used at the Kenworth factory during the exact time period when the murders occurred. It was the kind of evidence that could only come from someone who worked with that particular paint on a daily basis. But perhaps the most damning evidence was Ridgway's own confession. Faced with the prospect of the death penalty, he made a calculated decision that would define the remainder of his life. He agreed to cooperate with investigators, revealing the locations of bodies that had never been found and providing details about murders that had remained unsolved for decades. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to spare his life, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The confession sessions were unlike anything investigators had ever experienced. Ridgway sat calmly in interview rooms, recounting the details of his crimes with the same methodical precision he had once applied to his work. He described how he selected his victims, how he lured them to isolated locations, how he killed them and disposed of their bodies. There was no emotion in his voice, no remorse in his demeanor. He spoke about murder the way other people might discuss their daily routines. Over the course of several months, Ridgway confessed to 48 murders, though he hinted that the actual number might be higher. He claimed that he had initially told investigators he was responsible for 65 deaths, and in later interviews, he suggested the number could be as high as 71. The discrepancies didn't seem to bother him. To Ridgway, the exact count was less important than the act itself. He had killed because he wanted to kill, and he had continued killing because he could. His explanations for the murders were as chilling as the crimes themselves. He told investigators that he targeted sex workers because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. He knew they wouldn't be reported missing immediately, if at all. He said he hated most of them, viewing them as disposable objects rather than human beings. This twisted logic had allowed him to justify his actions in his own mind, transforming murder into what he saw as a form of community service. The details Ridgway provided about his methods revealed the depth of his depravity. He described how he would return to dump sites to engage in necrophilia with decomposing bodies, treating the corpses as objects for his sexual gratification. He explained how he would move bodies from one location to another to confuse investigators, sometimes revisiting burial sites multiple times. He talked about how he would place false evidence at crime scenes, attempting to throw police off his trail. What made Ridgway's confession particularly disturbing was his apparent understanding of investigative techniques. Despite his limited education and low IQ, he demonstrated a keen awareness of how police operated. He knew to avoid leaving fingerprints, to dispose of evidence carefully, and to maintain a facade of normalcy that would deflect suspicion. He had studied the investigation into his crimes, learning from the mistakes of other serial killers and adapting his methods accordingly. The impact of Ridgway's arrest and confession extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The Green River killings had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for decades, creating an atmosphere of fear that particularly affected vulnerable women. Sex workers, runaways, and others living on the margins of society had lived with the constant threat that they might be next. The knowledge that the killer had finally been caught brought a sense of relief to many, but it also highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed Ridgway to operate for so long. The case raised uncomfortable questions about how society values certain lives over others. Ridgway had deliberately targeted women he believed wouldn't be missed, and in many cases, he was right. Some victims weren't reported missing for weeks or months. Others were never reported at all. The investigation had been hampered by the fact that many victims came from communities that had little trust in law enforcement, making it difficult for police to gather information about their disappearances. In December 2003, Gary Ridgway was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea agreement had spared him from the death penalty, but it had also ensured that he would never walk free again. As he stood in the courtroom, listening to the judge read his sentence, Ridgway showed no emotion. He had made his choice, and he seemed content with the outcome. The families of his victims had mixed reactions to the plea deal. Some were grateful that Ridgway's cooperation had led to the discovery of their loved ones' remains, providing them with the closure they had sought for decades. Others felt that life in prison was too lenient a punishment for someone who had caused so much suffering. The debate over whether Ridgway deserved to die for his crimes would continue long after his sentencing, but the legal proceedings had come to an end. Today, Gary Ridgway sits in a maximum security prison, serving multiple life sentences for crimes that shocked the nation. He is now in his 70s, an aging man whose killing days are long behind him. He rarely grants interviews and has shown little interest in discussing his crimes beyond the confessions he provided to investigators. To him, the murders seem to be a closed chapter, something that happened in his past but no longer defines his present. The Green River case remains one of the most significant serial killer investigations in American history, both for the scope of the crimes and the length of time it took to solve them. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence even when technology isn't advanced enough to analyze it immediately. It showed how a methodical, patient approach to investigation could eventually yield results, even when the trail seems to have gone cold, and it proved that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who appear most ordinary, hiding in plain sight while they pursue their deadly obsessions. By the early 1990s, Gary Ridgway had seemingly perfected his deadly craft. He'd been killing for nearly a decade, leaving a trail of bodies scattered across Washington state while maintaining his facade as an ordinary family man. The Green River Task Force had amassed mountains of evidence, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and followed countless leads, yet Ridgway remained just another name in their files. He'd passed a polygraph test, cooperated with interviews, and continued living his quiet life in the suburbs. But beneath this calm exterior, something was shifting. The landscape of forensic science was evolving rapidly during this period. DNA technology, once the stuff of science fiction, was becoming a reality in criminal investigations. What had been impossible to detect in the early 1980s was now within reach of skilled technicians and advanced laboratory equipment. The microscopic evidence that had been overlooked for years was about to become the key that would finally unlock this case. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the late 1990s, Detective Tom Jensen was methodically reviewing old evidence when he noticed something that had been missed years earlier. Embedded in the clothing of several victims were tiny, almost invisible spheres of industrial spray paint. These weren't just random particles picked up from the environment. They were specific, unique, and traceable to a particular manufacturer and composition. The paint spheres told a story that investigators had been waiting decades to hear. They matched the exact type of spray paint used at the Kenworth truck factory, where Gary Ridgway had worked as a painter for over 30 years. The spheres had been embedded in the fabric used to strangle his victims, transferred from his work clothes or directly from his hands. It was microscopic evidence that placed him at the scene of multiple murders with scientific precision. But there was more. The DNA technology that had been in its infancy during the early years of the investigation had advanced dramatically. Saliva samples taken from Ridgway back in 1987 could now be analyzed with techniques that didn't exist when they were first collected. The genetic material that had been sitting in evidence storage for over a decade was about to speak. The DNA analysis revealed matches to semen found on several of the Green River victims. The probability of the samples belonging to someone other than Ridgway was astronomically small, measured in the billions to one. After nearly 20 years of investigation, the scientific evidence was finally catching up with the killer. Meanwhile, Ridgway continued his routine. He showed up to work at the truck factory, performed his duties as a spray painter, and went home to his wife Judith. To everyone around him, he remained the same quiet, religious man they'd always known. He attended church regularly, spoke softly, and seemed incapable of violence. His co-workers described him as someone who wouldn't hurt a fly, a gentle soul who kept to himself and caused no trouble, but investigators were closing in. The paint evidence and DNA matches were building an ironclad case against him. Detective Dave Reichert, who had been working the Green River case since 1982, finally had the evidence he'd been searching for. The same man who had consulted with Ted Bundy, who had followed hundreds of leads and interviewed countless suspects, was about to make the arrest that would define his career. The investigation team worked carefully to build their case. They couldn't afford any mistakes or procedural errors that might allow Ridgway to escape justice. Every piece of evidence was meticulously documented, every connection verified and re-verified. The paint spheres were analyzed multiple times by different laboratories. The DNA evidence was subjected to the most rigorous testing available. As the case against Ridgway strengthened, investigators began to piece together the full scope of his crimes. The timeline stretched back to 1982, with victims ranging from teenagers to women in their 30s. Most were sex workers or runaways, people who existed on the margins of society. They were women whose disappearances often went unreported for days or weeks, giving Ridgway time to dispose of evidence and establish alibis. The geographic pattern of the murders painted a picture of a methodical killer who knew the area intimately. Bodies were found in remote locations throughout King County, often in heavily wooded areas where they might remain undiscovered for months or years. Some victims were found in the Green River itself, while others were scattered across the landscape like a grotesque trail of breadcrumbs. Ridgway's knowledge of police procedures, gained through his multiple interviews and interactions with law enforcement, had helped him stay ahead of the investigation for years. He knew what investigators were looking for and had adapted his methods accordingly. He'd stopped leaving bodies in the river after the media attention made it too risky. He'd changed his disposal methods, varied his hunting grounds, and maintained his careful facade of normalcy. But forensic science had evolved beyond his ability to adapt. The microscopic paint spheres were evidence he couldn't see or control. The DNA technology was advancing faster than he could anticipate. The very job that had provided him with the means to kill his victims had also marked him in ways invisible to the naked eye. The psychological profile that had been developed over the years was proving remarkably accurate. Ridgway fit the description of an organized killer who could blend into society while maintaining his deadly double life. He was intelligent enough to avoid detection, but driven by compulsions he couldn't fully control. His hatred of sex workers, combined with his religious beliefs and sexual dysfunction, had created a perfect storm of violence that had lasted for decades. On November 30th, 2001, the long investigation finally reached its conclusion. Gary Ridgway was at work at the Kenworth truck factory, performing the same job he'd held for 3 decades when police officers arrived to place him under arrest. The quiet man who had painted trucks by day and hunted women by night was finally in custody. The Green River Killer's reign of terror was over. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members struggled to reconcile the mild-mannered man they knew with the monster he'd been revealed to be. His wife Judith claimed she'd had no idea about his crimes, though investigators noted that his kill rate had dropped significantly after their marriage. The man who had attended church regularly and spoke of his faith had been living a lie of unimaginable proportions. The evidence against Ridgway was overwhelming. The paint spheres, the DNA matches, and the circumstantial evidence created a case that would be nearly impossible to defend. As he sat in his jail cell, the weight of nearly 20 years of investigation was finally bearing down on him. The careful facade he'd maintained for so long was crumbling, and the true extent of his crimes was about to be revealed. As the investigation into the Green River murders dragged on through the 1980s and 1990s, Gary Ridgway continued his double life with chilling precision. By day, he was the reliable truck painter at Kenworth, showing up on time, doing his job, keeping his head down. By night, he prowled the strip, hunting for his next victim. What made him so terrifying wasn't just his brutality, it was his patience, his methodical approach, his ability to blend into the background while committing unspeakable acts. The body count kept climbing. Women disappeared from Pacific Highway South with disturbing regularity. Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, Opal Mills. The names became a grim roll call of the forgotten, the vulnerable, the disposable. Each murder followed the same pattern. Ridgway would cruise the strip in his pickup truck, sometimes with his young son sleeping in the back seat, projecting the image of a harmless family man. He'd approach sex workers with politeness, even kindness, offering them money for their services. Then he'd drive them to a secluded location, often near the Green River, where he would strangle them with his bare hands or with ligatures. But Ridgway didn't just kill and dump the bodies. He was meticulous about covering his tracks. He understood forensics better than most criminals. Despite his low IQ and poor academic record, he chose strangulation over weapons because he believed it was cleaner, leaving less evidence. He would carefully position the bodies, sometimes returning to the dump sites weeks or months later to move remains, making it harder for investigators to establish timelines. He planted false evidence at crime scenes, trying to throw detectives off his trail. If a victim scratched him during the attack, he would clip their fingernails and burn the scratches on his skin with battery acid to hide the wounds. The psychological profile that emerged from his later confessions revealed a man driven by a twisted sense of control and religious fervor. Ridgway claimed he targeted prostitutes because he hated them, viewing them as sinful and disposable. He believed he was cleaning up the streets, ridding society of what he saw as human garbage. This warped moral justification allowed him to continue killing without remorse, sometimes committing necrophilia with the corpses before disposing of them in remote wooded areas. The Green River Task Force, led by Detective Dave Reichert, was under enormous pressure to solve the case. The media attention was relentless, families were demanding answers, and the community was gripped by fear. In their desperation, investigators even consulted with imprisoned serial killer Ted Bundy, who provided insights into the psychology of the unknown killer. Bundy correctly predicted that the Green River Killer was revisiting dump sites to engage in necrophilia and suggested that police stake out fresh graves to catch him in the act. Despite these efforts, Ridgway remained elusive. He was interviewed multiple times by police, first coming to their attention in 1983 when Marie Malvar disappeared after getting into a truck matching his vehicle. Her boyfriend and pimp had tracked down Ridgway's house, convinced he was involved in her disappearance. But when detectives questioned him, Ridgway was calm, cooperative, and convincing. He acknowledged his history of soliciting prostitutes, but denied any involvement in the murders. He even passed a polygraph test, which gave investigators false confidence in his innocence. The truth was that Ridgway was a skilled liar who had perfected his deception over decades. During his 1983 interview, he strategically positioned himself against a fence to hide the scratch marks Marie Malvar had left on his arms during her final struggle. After the detectives left, he burned the scratches with battery acid to destroy the evidence. This level of forensic awareness was remarkable for someone with such limited education, but it demonstrated the calculating nature of his crimes. As the years passed, the killing spree seemed to slow down. After Ridgway married his third wife, Judith Mawson, in 1988, the murder rate dropped significantly. Only 3 of his confirmed victims were killed after this marriage. Ridgway later claimed that he truly loved Mawson and that his feelings for her reduced his urge to kill. But the reality was more complex. He was simply becoming more careful, more selective, adapting his methods to avoid detection. The breakthrough that would finally bring Ridgway to justice came from an unexpected source, microscopic paint spheres that had been overlooked for nearly 2 decades. These tiny particles, embedded in the clothing of his victims, were a unique industrial spray paint used at the Kenworth truck factory where Ridgway worked. The paint had been there all along, waiting in evidence boxes, but the forensic technology of the 1980s wasn't sophisticated enough to detect its significance. It wasn't until 2001, when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to match saliva samples taken from Ridgway in 1987 to semen found on several victims, that the case finally broke open. The microscopic paint evidence provided additional confirmation, linking him definitively to the murders. On November 30th, 2001, police arrived at the Kenworth factory to arrest Gary Ridgway. He was 52 years old and had been killing for nearly 2 decades. The man they led away in handcuffs was unremarkable in every way. Average height, thinning hair, quiet demeanor. He looked like any other factory worker heading home after a long shift. But inside that ordinary exterior was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, a man who had turned murder into a routine, who had perfected the art of making people disappear without a trace. The investigation into the Green River killings had reached a critical juncture by the late 1990s. For nearly 2 decades, the case had consumed countless resources, generated thousands of leads, and left investigators with more questions than answers. The task force had compiled a list of hundreds of suspects, interviewed thousands of witnesses, and collected mountains of evidence. Yet Gary Ridgway remained just another name in their files, a person of interest who had somehow managed to slip through their fingers time and again. What investigators didn't realize was that they had been tantalizingly close to their target all along. The microscopic evidence that would eventually seal Ridgway's fate had been sitting in evidence lockers for years, waiting for technology to catch up with the science. Embedded in the clothing of his victims were tiny spheres of industrial spray paint, so small they were invisible to the naked eye. These microscopic particles would prove to be the key that unlocked one of America's most notorious serial killer cases. The paint spheres weren't just any ordinary paint. They were from a very specific type of industrial coating used at the Kenworth truck manufacturing plant, where Ridgway worked as a spray painter. The unique composition and characteristics of this paint made it as distinctive as a fingerprint. But in the 1980s and early 1990s, the technology to detect and analyze such minute particles simply didn't exist in most crime laboratories. By the late 1990s, advances in forensic science had opened up new possibilities for cold case investigations. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated and reliable, and microscopic examination techniques had improved dramatically. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory began revisiting evidence from the Green River cases, applying new technologies to old clues that had been overlooked or deemed insignificant years earlier. The breakthrough came when forensic scientists discovered the paint spheres on the clothing of multiple victims. The spheres were so small that they had been completely missed during the initial examinations in the 1980s. When subjected to advanced microscopic analysis, these particles revealed their industrial origin and unique chemical composition. The paint was traced back to the specific type used at Kenworth during the time period when the murders occurred. This discovery was revolutionary for the investigation. For the first time, investigators had physical evidence that could potentially link a suspect directly to multiple crime scenes. The paint spheres created a forensic connection that went beyond circumstantial evidence or witness testimony. They represented a tangible link between the killer and his victims, one that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 20 years. The forensic breakthrough coincided with another significant development in the case. DNA technology had advanced to the point where scientists could extract and analyze genetic material from evidence that had previously been considered too degraded or contaminated to be useful. The saliva sample that police had collected from Ridgway back in 1987 suddenly became crucial evidence in a way that hadn't been possible when it was first obtained. In late 2001, King County Sheriff Dave Reichert, who had been one of the original investigators assigned to the Green River case, called a meeting to discuss the potential for applying new DNA technology to the old evidence. Reichert had never forgotten the case, and the unsolved murders had haunted him throughout his career. He was determined to give the investigation one final push using every available scientific tool. The DNA analysis yielded results that sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The saliva sample from Ridgway matched semen found on several of the victims. Combined with the paint sphere evidence, investigators finally had the scientific proof they needed to arrest their suspect. The man they had questioned multiple times, who had passed a polygraph test and who had been living quietly in their community for decades, was finally within their grasp. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was at work at the Kenworth factory, performing the same spray painting job he had held for 30 years when police arrived to arrest him. The arrest was conducted quietly and without incident. Ridgway didn't resist or attempt to flee. He simply looked up from his work, set down his equipment, and allowed himself to be handcuffed. The arrest sent ripples of shock through the community and the law enforcement agencies that had been hunting the Green River Killer for so long. After nearly 2 decades of investigation, countless false leads, and mounting frustration, they had finally captured one of America's most prolific serial killers. The man who had terrorized the Seattle area and claimed the lives of dozens of women was a mild-mannered truck painter who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that the killer had finally been caught, but also anger and frustration that it had taken so long. Many wondered how different things might have been if the forensic evidence had been properly analyzed years earlier. The missed opportunities and overlooked clues represented not just investigative failures, but lost chances to save lives. The arrest also raised uncomfortable questions about the investigation itself. How had Ridgway managed to evade capture for so long? What signs had been missed? Could some of the later murders have been prevented if the case had been handled differently? These questions would continue to haunt investigators and the families of victims long after Ridgway was behind bars. As news of the arrest spread, the full scope of Ridgway's crimes began to emerge. The quiet factory worker who had seemed so ordinary to his neighbors and co-workers was revealed to be a calculating predator who had operated with shocking efficiency and brutality. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions was so stark that many who knew him struggled to reconcile the two versions of the man they thought they knew. The arrest marked the end of one chapter in the Green River case, but it was also the beginning of another. With Ridgway in custody, investigators faced the daunting task of connecting him to the dozens of murders they believed he had committed. The forensic evidence that had led to his arrest was just the beginning of what would become one of the most extensive confession processes in criminal history. The confession Gary Ridgway gave to investigators was unlike anything they had ever encountered. For months, he sat in sterile interrogation rooms, methodically detailing decades of murder with the cold precision of a man reciting a grocery list. There was no emotion, no remorse, just clinical descriptions of how he had systematically hunted and killed nearly 50 women. The detectives who questioned him described feeling physically ill as Ridgway calmly explained his methods, his reasoning, and his complete lack of regard for human life. When asked why he chose sex workers as his victims, Ridgway's answer was chillingly practical. He told investigators that prostitutes were easy to pick up without being noticed, that they might not be reported missing right away, and that he could kill as many of them as he wanted without getting caught. He explained that he hated most of them, viewing them as disposable objects rather than human beings. His confession revealed a mind that had reduced murder to a simple equation of opportunity and hatred. The details Ridgway provided were exhaustive and horrifying. He described how he would cruise the strip along State Route 99, carefully selecting his victims from among the vulnerable women who worked the streets. He would present himself as a harmless family man, sometimes even having his young son in the back seat of his truck to appear less threatening. Once he gained their trust, he would drive them to secluded locations where he would strangle them, usually with his bare hands, though sometimes using ligatures or pieces of their own clothing. What made Ridgway's confession particularly disturbing was his matter-of-fact description of returning to the dump sites to commit acts of necrophilia. He told investigators that he would revisit the bodies multiple times, sometimes weeks after the initial murder, to engage in sexual acts with the decomposing remains. This revelation confirmed what serial killer Ted Bundy had predicted years earlier when he consulted with the Green River Task Force, suggesting that the killer was likely returning to the sites to have sex with his victims. Ridgway's organizational skills were evident in every aspect of his crimes. He explained how he would carefully choose dump sites in remote, wooded areas where the bodies would be difficult to find. He would sometimes move remains to different locations to confuse investigators, or spread them across multiple sites to make identification more challenging. He described how he would take victims' jewelry and personal items, not as trophies, but to dispose of them in different locations to eliminate evidence. The killer's understanding of forensic science was surprisingly sophisticated for someone with his limited education. He told investigators that he chose strangulation over other methods because it was cleaner and left less evidence. He would clip his victims' fingernails if they had scratched him during the attack, and he would change his tires frequently to avoid leaving traceable tread marks. He even admitted to placing false clues at crime scenes, including cigarette butts and gum, to throw investigators off his trail. Perhaps most chilling was Ridgway's description of his emotional state during the murders. He spoke of feeling powerful and in control, describing the act of killing as something he was particularly skilled at. He once told investigators The choking was what he did, and he was pretty good at it. The murders weren't crimes of passion or rage, but calculated acts that gave him a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. Ridgway's confession also revealed the extent to which he had compartmentalized his life. He described how he would commit murders in the early morning hours, then go to work at the Kenworth truck factory as if nothing had happened. He would attend church services, participate in community activities, and maintain relationships with 3 different wives, all while continuing his killing spree. His ability to present a normal facade while harboring such darkness demonstrated a level of psychological control that investigators found deeply unsettling. The geographic scope of Ridgway's crimes became clear through his detailed confessions. He described dump sites scattered across Washington state, from the banks of the Green River to remote forests in the Cascade Mountains. Some bodies were placed in areas so isolated that they might never have been found without his directions. He led investigators to several previously unknown dump sites where they recovered remains that had been missing for decades. Ridgway's confession process was methodical and comprehensive. Over the course of several months, he worked with investigators to create detailed maps of dump sites, provided descriptions of victims he could remember, and helped identify remains that had been found but never connected to the Green River case. He would often spend hours describing single incidents, providing investigators with information that only the killer could have known. The psychological evaluation of Ridgway during his confession period revealed a man who showed no signs of mental illness or delusion. He was fully aware of what he had done and understood the consequences of his actions. His confession wasn't driven by guilt or a desire for redemption, but by the practical benefits of his plea agreement. He had calculated that cooperation would save him from the death penalty, and he approached the confession process with the same cold logic he had applied to his crimes. What emerged from Ridgway's confession was a portrait of one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who had turned murder into a routine part of his life for nearly 2 decades. His detailed admissions provided closure for dozens of families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones, while simultaneously revealing the true horror of what those victims had endured. The confession stands as one of the most comprehensive and disturbing documents in the history of American criminal investigation, a testament to the depths of human evil and the painstaking work required to bring such monsters to justice. By the time Gary Ridgway reached his 40s, he had perfected the art of deception. To his co-workers at Kenworth, he was Gary the reliable truck painter who showed up early, worked hard, and never caused trouble. To his third wife, Judith, he was a devoted husband who read the Bible and attended church regularly. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet, middle-aged man living an ordinary suburban life. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked something far more sinister. The years between 1982 and 1984 marked the peak of Ridgway's killing spree. During this period, he claimed the lives of over 40 women, most of them young sex workers and runaways who frequented the Pacific Highway Strip. His method was chillingly consistent. He would cruise the area in his paint-splattered pickup truck, sometimes with his young son in the back seat, projecting an image of harmless normalcy that made potential victims feel safe getting into his vehicle. What made Ridgway particularly dangerous was his understanding of forensic science despite his below-average intelligence. He deliberately chose strangulation over weapons because he believed it was cleaner. He would clip his victims' fingernails if they scratched him during their final moments. He purchased new tires to eliminate tire track evidence. He even went so far as to place false clues at crime scenes to mislead investigators, and would sometimes move bodies to make them harder to find. His knowledge of police procedures was equally disturbing. When Marie Malvar's boyfriend and pimp tracked down his truck in 1983, Ridgway stood against a fence during police questioning to conceal the scratches she had left on his arm while fighting for her life. After the detectives left, he burned the wounds with battery acid to eliminate any trace evidence. This wasn't the panicked reaction of a desperate man. It was the calculated behavior of someone who had thought through every contingency. The psychological profile that emerged from his later confessions revealed a man driven by a twisted sense of control and a deep-seated hatred of women, particularly sex workers. He told investigators that he chose prostitutes because they were easy to pick up without being noticed, and because he believed they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about exploiting society's indifference toward his chosen victims. Ridgway's relationship with his third wife, Judith, provided him with the perfect cover. She later recalled how he would leave for work unusually early some mornings, claiming he needed the overtime pay. What she didn't know was that these early departures often coincided with his hunting expeditions. The carpet in their home had mysteriously disappeared during their relationship, something she only understood years later when detectives told her he had probably used it to wrap a body. Perhaps most chilling was his ability to compartmentalize his crimes. He maintained his job at Kenworth for 30 years, painting trucks with the same spray paint that would eventually link him to his victims. He attended church regularly, even as he was committing acts of unspeakable violence. He played the role of stepfather to Judith's children, while simultaneously destroying dozens of other families. The necrophilia aspect of his crimes added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable situation. Ridgway would return to dump sites repeatedly to engage in sexual acts with decomposing corpses. He told investigators that he eventually began burying victims deeper specifically to resist this urge, showing a disturbing level of self-awareness about his own depravity. His ability to evade capture for nearly 2 decades wasn't just luck, it was the result of careful planning and an intuitive understanding of how the system worked. He knew that society's most vulnerable members made the perfect victims because their disappearances would generate minimal investigation. He understood that without physical evidence, even suspicious behavior wouldn't be enough to convict him. The psychological warfare he waged extended beyond his victims to their families and the investigating officers. Detective Dave Reichert, who worked the case for years, later described the toll of knowing that somewhere out there, a killer was continuing to claim lives while they struggled to find him. The community lived in fear, particularly women working the streets who knew they could be next but had few alternatives. When DNA technology finally caught up with Ridgway in 2001, the evidence was overwhelming. Paint spheres from his workplace were found on victims' clothing. Genetic material linked him to multiple crime scenes, and suddenly The quiet truck painter was revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The arrest came at the very place where he had maintained his facade for decades, the Kenworth factory floor where he had worked while planning and executing his crimes. The confession that followed was as methodical as his murders had been. Over months of interviews, Ridgway calmly recounted details of 49 confirmed killings, though he hinted the actual number might be higher. He showed no remorse, no emotion, treating the interviews like a business transaction. His only regret, he claimed, was that he hadn't killed more. The investigation into Gary Ridgway's crimes represents one of the most complex and lengthy serial killer cases in American history. What makes this case particularly haunting is how close authorities came to catching him decades before they actually did, and how many lives might have been saved if certain evidence had been properly analyzed when it was first discovered. The Green River Task Force, formed in 1982, became one of the largest and most expensive serial killer investigations ever undertaken. At its peak, the task force employed dozens of detectives, forensic specialists, and support staff. They interviewed thousands of potential witnesses, compiled lists of hundreds of suspects, and collected mountains of physical evidence from crime scenes scattered across Washington state. The sheer scope of the investigation was overwhelming, with case files eventually filling entire rooms at the King County Sheriff's Office. What's particularly striking about this case is how Ridgway managed to hide in plain sight for so long. He wasn't some shadowy figure operating from the margins of society. He was a regular churchgoer, a steady employee, a man who seemed to embody the values of hard work and religious devotion that defined many American communities. His co-workers at the Kenworth truck factory described him as quiet, dependable, and unremarkable. He showed up to work every day, did his job painting trucks, and went home to his suburban house like millions of other Americans. But this ordinary facade masked something far more sinister. Ridgway had developed an almost scientific approach to murder. He understood forensic science well enough to know that strangulation left less evidence than shootings or stabbings. He knew to clip his victims' fingernails if they scratched him during their final moments. He purchased new tires for his truck to eliminate tire track evidence. He even went so far as to plant false evidence at crime scenes to throw investigators off his trail. This wasn't the work of a disorganized killer acting on impulse. This was methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. The victims Ridgway chose were carefully selected for their vulnerability. Prostitutes, runaways, and drug addicts were people society often overlooked, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. He prowled the Pacific Highway South, known locally as the Strip, a stretch of road dotted with cheap motels, strip clubs, and the kind of establishments that attracted both predators and prey. Here, among the neon signs and broken dreams, Ridgway found an endless supply of potential victims. His method was as disturbing as it was effective. He would approach women with the demeanor of a friendly, harmless family man. Sometimes, he even had his young son in the car with him, using the child's presence to make potential victims feel safe. He would offer them money for sex, drive them to secluded locations, and then kill them, usually by strangulation. What happened next was even more horrifying. Ridgway would return to the dump sites repeatedly to engage in necrophilia with the decomposing corpses. He later told investigators that he would sometimes move bodies to different locations, not to avoid detection, but to have sex with them again. The psychological profile that emerged from Ridgway's eventual confession revealed a man consumed by contradictions. He was deeply religious, attending church regularly and reading the Bible, yet he was committing some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. He claimed to love his third wife, Judith Mawson, and investigators noted that his killing spree slowed significantly after their marriage. Yet he continued to pick up prostitutes and murder them, even while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband. Perhaps most chilling was Ridgway's complete lack of remorse. During his confession, he spoke about his crimes with the same emotional detachment one might use to describe a routine work task. He referred to his victims as garbage and expressed regret only that he hadn't killed more. When asked why he targeted prostitutes, his answer was coldly pragmatic. They were easy to pick up, unlikely to be missed, and he hated most of them. This wasn't passion or rage driving him to kill. It was something much colder and more calculating. The breakthrough that finally led to Ridgway's arrest came from advances in DNA technology that weren't available during the early years of the investigation. In 1987, police had obtained saliva and hair samples from Ridgway during one of their routine interviews with potential suspects. At the time, DNA analysis was still in its infancy, and the samples were stored away as the investigation continued. By 2001, however, DNA technology had advanced to the point where even small, degraded samples could be analyzed with remarkable accuracy. When investigators finally ran Ridgway's DNA against evidence collected from the crime scenes, they found matches on multiple victims. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. On November 30th, 2001, nearly 20 years after the first Green River murder, police arrested Gary Ridgway at his workplace. He was 62 years old, a grandfather, still showing up to work every day and maintaining his reputation as a reliable employee. The confession that followed was as comprehensive as it was disturbing. Over the course of several months, Ridgway provided detailed accounts of 49 murders, though he hinted that the actual number might be higher. He led investigators to previously undiscovered dump sites, helped identify victims who had remained nameless for decades, and provided insights into his methods that both horrified and fascinated criminal psychologists. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ridgway's confession was his description of the microscopic paint spheres that had been embedded in some of his victims' clothing. These spheres came from the industrial spray paint used at the Kenworth factory where he worked. The tragic irony is that this evidence was present from the very beginning of the investigation, but the forensic technology of the early 1980s wasn't sophisticated enough to detect it. If it had been found then, dozens of lives might have been saved. The paint evidence also revealed just how intimately Ridgway's crimes were connected to his everyday life. He was literally carrying his workplace home with him, embedding evidence of his legitimate employment in the clothing of his victims. It was as if his two worlds, the respectable truck painter and the serial killer, were physically intertwined in ways that investigators couldn't see until decades later. Ridgway's plea bargain was controversial, but ultimately necessary. Facing the death penalty, he agreed to confess to all his crimes and help locate additional victims in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The families of his victims were divided on this decision. Some wanted him executed for his crimes, while others were grateful for the closure that his confession provided. Many had spent decades not knowing what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Ridgway's detailed admissions finally gave them answers, even if those answers were more horrible than they had imagined. The Green River Killer case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial killer investigations. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, even when current technology can't analyze it. The value of long-term task forces that can maintain institutional knowledge over decades, and the critical role that advances in forensic science can play in solving cold cases. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized populations and the way that prejudice and indifference can allow predators to operate with impunity. Today, Gary Ridgway sits in a maximum security prison in Washington state, serving 49 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's now in his 70s, an elderly man who will die behind bars for crimes that terrorized the Pacific Northwest for nearly 2 decades. He rarely grants interviews and has shown no signs of remorse for his actions. To the end, he remains what he has always been, a cold, calculating killer who viewed human life as disposable. The legacy of the Green River Killer extends far beyond the specific crimes Gary Ridgway committed. His case serves as a stark reminder of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, how prejudice and societal indifference can enable monsters to operate freely, and how the march of scientific progress can eventually bring justice even when it seems impossible. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every statistic, every case number, every crime scene photograph, there was a human being whose life was cut short by unimaginable cruelty. The ripple effects of Gary Ridgway's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, fundamentally altering how society approaches serial murder investigations and victim advocacy. The Green River Killer case became a watershed moment in criminal justice, demonstrating both the devastating consequences of institutional neglect and the transformative power of technological advancement in solving cold cases. In the aftermath of Ridgway's conviction, the families of his victims faced a complex journey toward healing. Many expressed relief that their loved one's killer had finally been identified and imprisoned, yet the decades of uncertainty had left deep scars. For some families, Ridgway's confessions provided crucial answers about their daughter's final moments, while others struggled with the clinical detachment he displayed when describing their murders. The victim impact statements during his sentencing revealed the profound and lasting trauma inflicted not just by the murders themselves, but by years of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Patricia Yellow Robe's sister spoke of the sleepless nights spent wondering if her sister was still alive somewhere. Wendy Caulfield's family described the agony of seeing other families receive closure while their questions remained unanswered. These testimonies underscored a critical truth about serial murder cases. The investigation period often compounds the initial trauma, creating secondary victims among family members who endure prolonged uncertainty and repeated disappointment as leads fail to materialize. The law enforcement response to the Green River case catalyzed significant changes in how serial murder investigations are conducted. The formation of the Green River Task Force, while initially struggling with resource limitations and jurisdictional complexities, eventually became a model for multi-agency cooperation. The task force's evolution from a small, overwhelmed unit to a sophisticated investigative operation demonstrated the necessity of sustained commitment and adequate funding in serial murder cases. Detective Tom Jensen, who spent nearly 2 decades working the Green River case, later reflected on the lessons learned during those years. The investigation highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed evidence logs, preserving physical evidence even when current technology couldn't analyze it effectively, and treating every potential victim with equal priority regardless of their lifestyle or circumstances. These practices, refined through the painful experience of the Green River investigation, became standard protocol for serial murder cases nationwide. The technological breakthrough that finally solved the case marked a turning point in forensic science applications. The DNA analysis that conclusively linked Ridgway to multiple victims represented the culmination of decades of advancement in genetic testing. When the investigation began in 1982, DNA fingerprinting was still in its infancy, and the sophisticated techniques that would eventually identify Ridgway were not yet available. The preservation of evidence from the crime scenes, despite years of storage and handling, proved crucial when technology finally caught up to the investigative need. This technological evolution highlighted the importance of evidence preservation in cold cases. The Green River investigation demonstrated that seemingly hopeless cases could be revitalized by scientific advancement, encouraging law enforcement agencies to maintain cold case units and preserve evidence indefinitely. The success of the DNA analysis in the Ridgway case contributed to the expansion of DNA databases and the development of more sophisticated genetic analysis techniques, tools that would prove invaluable in solving countless other crimes. The societal impact of the Green River case extended into discussions about victim vulnerability and social responsibility. The fact that Ridgway specifically targeted sex workers and runaways forced uncomfortable conversations about how society treats its most marginalized members. Many of his victims had been dismissed by authorities as unreliable witnesses or unimportant missing persons, their disappearances initially attributed to lifestyle choices rather than potential criminal victimization. This institutional bias contributed to Ridgway's ability to continue killing for years without detection. The delayed response to missing person reports, the assumption that these women had simply moved on or chosen to disappear, and the general societal indifference to the fate of sex workers created an environment where a predator could operate with relative impunity. The case became a stark reminder that every victim deserves equal protection and investigation, regardless of their circumstances or choices. Advocacy groups used the Green River case to push for better protections for vulnerable populations. The murders highlighted the dangers faced by women in prostitution and the need for comprehensive approaches to reducing these risks. Some advocates pushed for decriminalization or legalization of sex work, arguing that criminalization forced these activities underground and made participants more vulnerable to predators like Ridgway. Others focused on expanding services for runaways and homeless youth, addressing the root causes that made these young people susceptible to exploitation. The case also influenced academic research into serial murder patterns and prevention strategies. Criminologists studied Ridgway's methods, victim selection, and the investigative response to identify patterns that might help in future cases. His careful selection of victims from marginalized populations, his ability to maintain a normal facade while committing horrific crimes, and his methodical approach to body disposal became subjects of extensive analysis. Research into Ridgway's psychological profile contributed to the development of more sophisticated offender profiling techniques. His combination of organized planning and opportunistic victim selection challenged some existing theories about serial killer typologies. The fact that he could maintain steady employment, relationships, and community connections while actively murdering women demonstrated the complexity of criminal psychology and the limitations of relying too heavily on behavioral profiles in investigations. The economic impact of the Green River case was substantial, with the investigation costing millions of dollars over its 20-year span. The financial burden on King County and the state of Washington raised questions about resource allocation in serial murder cases. However, the eventual resolution of the case through DNA analysis validated the long-term investment in the investigation and demonstrated the value of persistent, well-funded cold case work. The costs associated with the investigation included not only direct law enforcement expenses, but also the broader economic impact on the community. The fear generated by the unsolved murders affected local businesses, particularly in the areas where bodies were discovered. The negative publicity surrounding the case impacted tourism and economic development in the region, though these effects were difficult to quantify precisely. Media coverage of the Green River case evolved significantly over the 2 decades of investigation. Initial reporting focused on the dramatic aspects of the crimes and the investigative efforts, but coverage became more sophisticated as the case progressed. Journalists began examining the social issues highlighted by the murders, including the vulnerability of sex workers and the challenges faced by law enforcement in investigating crimes against marginalized populations. The extensive media attention also raised ethical questions about the coverage of serial murder cases. The balance between informing the public and potentially glorifying the perpetrator became a subject of ongoing debate. Some critics argued that sensationalized coverage of serial killers could inspire copycat crimes, while others contended that public awareness was essential for prevention and victim identification. When Ridgway was finally arrested and began confessing, the media coverage shifted to focus on the investigative breakthrough and the long-awaited closure for victims' families. The dramatic nature of his workplace arrest and the subsequent confessions provided compelling material for news coverage, but reporters also grappled with how to present information about the crimes without being gratuitously graphic or disrespectful to the victims. The psychological evaluation of Ridgway during his confession period provided insights into the mind of a serial killer that had rarely been available in previous cases. His willingness to discuss his crimes in detail, combined with his apparent lack of genuine remorse, offered researchers and law enforcement professionals a unique opportunity to understand the motivations and thought processes of a prolific serial murderer. Dr. Mary Ellen O'Toole, a former FBI profiler who studied the case, noted that Ridgway's confessions revealed a level of calculated planning that exceeded what investigators had initially suspected. His descriptions of returning to crime scenes, his methods for selecting victims, and his strategies for avoiding detection demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation techniques. This knowledge appeared to have been acquired through media coverage of other cases and possibly through his interactions with law enforcement during earlier questioning. The clinical nature of Ridgway's confessions was particularly disturbing to those who worked with him during the process. He described the murders as problem-solving exercises, discussing logistics and practical considerations with the same emotional detachment one might use to describe a work project. This psychological profile contributed to ongoing research into psychopathy and antisocial personality disorders, providing real-world data about how these conditions manifest in extreme criminal behavior. The impact of the Green River case on popular culture was significant, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional works. The case became a reference point for discussions about serial murder in America, joining the ranks of other notorious cases, like those of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. However, the Green River case was unique in its scale, duration, and the eventual resolution through technological advancement. True crime enthusiasts and researchers continue to study the case for insights into criminal behavior and investigative techniques. The extensive documentation of the investigation, including thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and evidence logs, provides an unprecedented resource for understanding how serial murder investigations evolve over time. This documentation has been invaluable for training law enforcement professionals and educating the public about the complexities of criminal investigation. The legacy of the Green River case extends into contemporary discussions about criminal justice reform and victim advocacy. The case highlighted systemic issues that continue to affect how crimes against marginalized populations are investigated and prosecuted. While significant progress has been made in addressing these issues, advocates argue that much work remains to be done to ensure equal protection for all potential victims. Modern technology continues to build on the foundation established by the Green River investigation. Advanced DNA analysis techniques, improved database systems, and sophisticated forensic tools have made it possible to solve cold cases that were previously considered hopeless. The success of the Ridgway investigation encouraged law enforcement agencies to re-examine their cold case files and apply new technologies to old evidence. The development of familial DNA searching, genetic genealogy, and other advanced techniques has revolutionized cold case investigations. These tools, which were unimaginable when the Green River investigation began, have solved numerous cases and provided closure for families who had given up hope. The precedent set by the successful resolution of the Green River case continues to inspire persistence in seemingly impossible investigations. Educational institutions have incorporated the Green River case into their curricula for criminal justice, forensic science, and psychology programs. The case provides a comprehensive example of how investigations evolve, how technology can transform cold cases, and how social factors influence both criminal behavior and law enforcement response. Students studying these fields continue to analyze the case for insights that might apply to current and future investigations. The international impact of the Green River case has been notable as well. Law enforcement agencies around the world have studied the investigation's methods and outcomes, adapting successful strategies to their own jurisdictions. The case has been presented at international conferences on criminal investigation and has influenced policy discussions about serial murder investigations in multiple countries. As we reflect on the full scope of the Green River case, several key lessons emerge that continue to resonate today. First, the importance of treating all victims with equal dignity and priority, regardless of their circumstances or lifestyle choices. The delayed response to many of the disappearances in this case contributed to Ridgway's ability to continue killing, and this lesson has influenced how law enforcement agencies approach missing person cases involving vulnerable populations. Second, the case demonstrated the crucial importance of evidence preservation and the potential for technological advancement to solve seemingly impossible cases. The DNA evidence that finally convicted Ridgway had been collected decades earlier by investigators who had no way of knowing how it would eventually be used. This foresight in evidence collection and preservation has become a standard practice that continues to solve cold cases today. Third, the investigation highlighted the need for sustained commitment and adequate resources in serial murder cases. The Green River Task Force's eventual success was built on decades of persistent work by dedicated investigators who refused to give up despite numerous setbacks and false leads. This persistence, supported by consistent funding and institutional commitment, proved essential to the case's resolution. Fourth, the case underscored the importance of interagency cooperation and information sharing in complex criminal investigations. The Green River case involved multiple jurisdictions and agencies, and the eventual success required unprecedented levels of coordination and communication. This collaborative approach has become a model for similar investigations nationwide. Finally, the case demonstrated the complex relationship between criminal behavior and social factors. Ridgway's ability to target vulnerable populations with relative impunity highlighted systemic issues that extend far beyond individual criminal acts. Addressing these broader social problems remains an ongoing challenge that requires sustained effort from multiple sectors of society. The story of Gary Ridgway and the Green River murders serves as a sobering reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist behind the most ordinary facades. For nearly 2 decades, Ridgway lived among his community as an unremarkable man leading an apparently normal life. He worked steadily, maintained relationships, and participated in social activities, all while systematically murdering vulnerable women with calculating precision. This duality challenges our assumptions about how evil manifests in society. The image of the obviously disturbed or visibly dangerous criminal does not account for predators like Ridgway, who can compartmentalize their behavior and maintain convincing facades of normalcy. This reality has important implications for personal safety, community awareness, and law enforcement strategies. The victims of the Green River Killer were not random casualties, but individuals with their own stories, dreams, and connections to family and community. Wendy Caulfield was a teenager struggling with family problems when she encountered Ridgway. Deborah Bonner was a young mother trying to support her children. Marcia Chapman was working to overcome drug addiction. Each victim had a life that was cut short by Ridgway's calculated violence, and their stories deserve to be remembered alongside the details of their deaths. The families of these victims showed remarkable strength and resilience throughout the long investigation and its aftermath. Many became advocates for other victims' families, working to ensure that their loved ones would not be forgotten and that other families would not endure the same prolonged uncertainty they had experienced. Their advocacy contributed to important changes in how missing person cases are handled and how victims' families are supported during long-term investigations. Today, more than 2 decades after Ridgway's arrest, the Green River case continues to influence criminal justice practices and social policy. The investigative techniques developed during the case have been refined and applied to countless other investigations. The social issues highlighted by the murders continue to be subjects of policy debate and reform efforts. The technological advances that solved the case have evolved into even more sophisticated tools for solving crimes and identifying perpetrators. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of supporting vulnerable populations and addressing the social conditions that make individuals susceptible to predators. The fact that Ridgway was able to target sex workers and runaways with relative impunity highlighted the need for better protections and services for these populations. While progress has been made in addressing these issues, the work continues. As we conclude this examination of the Green River case, it's important to remember that behind the statistics, investigative procedures, and legal proceedings were real people whose lives were forever changed by Gary Ridgway's actions. The 49 confirmed victims, their families, the investigators who worked tirelessly to solve the case, and the community that lived in fear for years all bear the lasting impact of these crimes. The resolution of the Green River case brought closure to many, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in understanding and preventing serial murder. The lessons learned from this investigation continue to save lives and solve crimes, ensuring that the victims of Gary Ridgway did not die in vain. Their memory lives on in the improved investigative techniques, policy changes, and social awareness that emerged from this tragic chapter in criminal history. The final chapter of Gary Ridgway's story began on November 30th, 2001, when he was arrested at his workplace at Kenworth Truck Company. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 2 decades was finally brought to justice, not through traditional detective work alone, but through the relentless march of scientific progress. DNA evidence that had been collected years earlier could now be processed with unprecedented accuracy, and those microscopic paint spheres that had seemed like mere curiosities suddenly became the smoking gun that investigators had been searching for. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Seattle community and beyond. Here was a man who had attended company picnics, participated in workplace safety meetings, and maintained what appeared to be a stable marriage. His neighbors described him as quiet, but unremarkable. His co-workers knew him as reliable and punctual. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex as they were lengthy. Initially, prosecutors sought the death penalty, viewing Ridgway's crimes as among the most heinous ever committed in Washington state. However, the case took an unexpected turn when Ridgway's defense team proposed a plea bargain. In exchange for avoiding execution, Ridgway would plead guilty to multiple counts of murder and, crucially, would cooperate fully with investigators to help locate the remains of victims who had never been found. This decision proved controversial. Families of victims were divided between those who wanted to see Ridgway executed and those who desperately needed closure, needing to know where their loved ones had been left. The pragmatic reality was that Ridgway possessed information that could bring peace to families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their daughters, sisters, and mothers. On November 5th, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood before Judge Richard Jones in King County Superior Court and entered guilty pleas to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with family members of his victims, many of whom would have the opportunity to address their loved one's killer directly. The impact statements that followed were heart-wrenching testimonies to lives cut short and families forever changed. Some family members expressed forgiveness, finding it within themselves to show mercy to the man who had shown none to their loved ones. Others spoke of their unending grief and rage, describing how Ridgway's actions had destroyed not just individual lives, but entire family structures. Children had grown up without mothers, parents had died never knowing what happened to their daughters, and siblings had lived with survivor's guilt for decades. Ridgway himself showed little emotion during these proceedings. His responses were mechanical, almost robotic, as he answered questions about his crimes with the same detached precision he had used to plan them. When asked about his motivations, he spoke of his hatred for prostitutes and his desire to clean up the streets, revealing a twisted moral framework that allowed him to justify his actions even as he admitted to their horror. The judge sentenced Ridgway to life in prison without the possibility of parole, multiple life sentences running consecutively. As part of his plea agreement, Ridgway was required to undergo extensive interviews with investigators, psychologists, and FBI profilers. These sessions, conducted over many months, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. During these interviews, Ridgway displayed an almost encyclopedic memory for the details of his crimes, while simultaneously claiming to have little recollection of his victims as individuals. He could describe with clinical precision how he had murdered someone, but would claim not to remember their name or anything about their personality. This selective memory appeared to be another psychological defense mechanism, allowing him to maintain his dehumanization of his victims even after his capture. The information Ridgway provided led investigators to several previously undiscovered remains, bringing some measure of closure to families who had waited decades for answers. However, he also confessed to murders for which no bodies were ever found, suggesting that his victim count might be even higher than the 48 murders for which he was convicted. The Green River Killer case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations. The task force's experiences led to improvements in interagency cooperation, evidence preservation, and the integration of new technologies into active investigations. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining long-term investigative efforts, even when cases appear to go cold. Perhaps most significantly, the case exposed the societal attitudes that had allowed Ridgway to operate for so long. The fact that most of his victims were prostitutes, runaways, and other marginalized women meant that their disappearances often received less attention than they deserved. Some were not reported missing for weeks or months, if at all. This delayed response time gave Ridgway crucial advantages in disposing of evidence and distancing himself from his crimes. The case sparked important conversations about how society views and treats vulnerable populations. Advocacy groups pointed out that if Ridgway had been targeting middle class suburban women, the investigation might have received more resources and attention from the beginning. The victims of the Green River Killer were not faceless statistics, but daughters, mothers, and sisters who deserved the same level of protection and justice as anyone else. Today, Gary Ridgway remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he will spend the rest of his life. Reports from prison staff describe him as a model inmate who keeps to himself and causes no trouble. He has reportedly found religion and claims to have changed, though psychologists remain skeptical about the authenticity of his transformation. The families of his victims continue to grapple with the aftermath of his crimes. Some have become advocates for victims' rights or have worked to improve support services for vulnerable populations. Others have chosen to retreat from public attention, focusing on private healing and remembrance of their loved ones. The Green River Killer case serves as a stark reminder of how evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy. Ridgway's ability to compartmentalize his life, maintaining steady employment and relationships while simultaneously committing horrific murders, challenges our assumptions about how monsters behave. He was not the wild-eyed maniac of popular imagination, but a methodical, calculating predator who understood how to exploit both human vulnerability and systemic indifference. The case also demonstrates the critical importance of forensic science in modern criminal investigation. Without advances in DNA analysis and microscopic evidence examination, Ridgway might never have been caught. His crimes spanned an era of tremendous technological advancement, and it was ultimately technology that brought him to justice. And we reflect on the Green River Killer case, we must remember that behind the statistics and forensic evidence were real people whose lives were violently cut short. Each victim had dreams, relationships, and potential that will never be realized. Their deaths serve as a somber reminder of the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members and ensuring that justice is pursued with equal vigor, regardless of the victim's social status. The case of Gary Ridgway stands as one of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide in plain sight. For over 2 decades, this seemingly ordinary man terrorized the Pacific Northwest while maintaining the facade of a devoted Christian and hard-working family man. His ability to compartmentalize his horrific crimes while living what appeared to be a normal life demonstrates the terrifying reality that monsters often walk among us undetected. The Green River Killer investigation fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial murder cases. The preservation of evidence, the application of advancing DNA technology, and the importance of interagency cooperation all became crucial lessons learned from this prolonged nightmare. The case also forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about how we value certain lives over others. Ridgway deliberately targeted society's most vulnerable women, knowing that their disappearances would generate less public outcry and investigative urgency. Perhaps most disturbing is Ridgway's complete lack of remorse. His cold, calculated confessions revealed a man who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. His necrophilic behavior and casual attitude toward the murders he committed paint a picture of someone fundamentally disconnected from human empathy. Today, Gary Ridgway remains imprisoned at the Washington State Penitentiary, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. While justice was eventually served, the scars left by his crimes continue to affect the families of his victims and the communities he terrorized. The Green River Killer case serves as a stark reminder that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary faces, and that the pursuit of justice sometimes requires decades of unwavering determination. Though Ridgway's reign of terror has ended, his crimes will forever remain a dark chapter in American criminal history.